Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, I wanted to discuss the possibility of the Nintendo Switch 2 not having a good launch lineup. Will it be the end of the world for Nintendo? Will it be the end of the world for the Nintendo Switch 2 itself? And will it even have a profound impact on the long-term sales of this console? But first I wanted to ask the question, does the launch lineup even matter to begin with? Does it matter if a launch lineup is good or not? Well, of course, the easy answer to this question is yes. Of course, the launch lineup is important, and of course, it does matter. It will have an effect on the sales of the console, especially at the beginning. This kind of sets the stage for the rest of the console's lifespan when you think about it. If a system has a good library of games to start with, that is a good first impression, and that's what this is really about at the end of the day. Launch lineups, in many ways, are part of a console's first impression. Of course, there's the console itself, but if we're talking about video game consoles, then the console itself doesn't really matter. The games do. It's the games that really sell it. So imagine the original Nintendo Switch. Now imagine that without any games. Would the Nintendo Switch matter if it didn't have any good games that you could play on it? Of course not. Of course, the concept is very interesting. You can take console quality games wherever you go. It's a home console handheld hybrid system. So naturally you can take games with you wherever you go. That's the central hook of the system. But what if there are no games to play on the system? Then of course the system doesn't matter. It's the games that sell it. So of course a initial launch lineup does matter. And of course the quality of said lineup is very, very important. And so now that we've established, yes, a solid launch lineup is very important and really does matter. How much will it affect the Nintendo Switch 2? If the launch lineup is a good launch lineup, then it'll obviously be in a more favorable position. The initial sales of the system will be more favorable, the reception will be more favorable, and arguably most importantly, everyone who is playing the system at launch will have an ample supply of great games to play. They won't just be sitting there twiddling their thumbs, they'll actually be able to play some games. And again, hopefully games that they enjoy. If people don't have any good games to enjoy during the launch of this new console, then of course even word of mouth will drop. There won't be as much positive things to say about the system because no one's really playing anything on it. No one's really having these new video game experiences because the launch lineup is weak. So to delve deeper into why I feel that the launch lineup is particularly important, we're going to go back to the past a bit. So of course, let's talk about some popular Nintendo consoles and their launch lineups, starting of course with the Nintendo 64. I wanted to talk about the Nintendo 64 primarily because it has arguably one of the most interesting launch lineups. When the Nintendo 64 launched, how many games do you think it launched with? Particularly in North America. Did it launch with 10 games? Did it launch with 25 games? Did it launch with 100 games? No, it launched with just 2 games. Pilotwings 64, and of course, the revolutionary Super Mario 64. So of course, depending on who you ask, some people, I would argue most people would say, this is a pretty weak launch lineup. 2 games. So what if you're not a Mario fan? What if you're not a Pilotwings fan? What if you're not a Nintendo fan? But you wanted to get a Nintendo 64 because of the promise of great games with beautiful, brand new, revolutionary graphics, and you wanted to play some third-party games on it. Well, you can't. Just simply put, you're out of luck in that regard, especially at the launch, because many of them were flat-out delayed. So even games like Star Wars could have come out at launch, but it was, of course, delayed. So you ended up having 2 first-party Nintendo games, both being fairly great games, but what if you weren't a fan of those franchises? What if you're not a Mario fan and you didn't want to give Mario 64 a chance? Well, then you're kind of out of luck. So you really only had 2 options at launch. And of course, there's the argument that it was actually a strong launch lineup. Personally, I don't really feel like it's particularly strong, but it does have one very, very strong game in it, and that is Super Mario 64, a very revolutionary game, and one of my personal favorites of all time. But we are just talking about 2 games here. It's hard to consider this a strong library, a strong launch lineup, with only 2 games. Of course, the Nintendo 64, at the end of the day, sold about 33 million units worldwide during its entire lifespan. The launch lineup itself may not have been too much of a factor. Maybe it was. But we all know that the Nintendo 64 had stiff competition with the PlayStation, and there were also other reasons why the system didn't perform as well as Nintendo had hoped. Some of it due to the lack of third-party games during its lifespan. Some of it due to the fact that it didn't get some support because of its use of cartridges rather than discs. There's a lot of reasons why the Nintendo 64 didn't perform as well as Nintendo hoped, but of course a launch lineup and having an initial first impression, like a weak launch lineup, probably still hampered its performance at the beginning, and just in general, it most likely played a slight role in this whole thing. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about a system that actually sold pretty decently by the end of its life. Let's talk about the Nintendo 3DS. This is a system that sold roughly 75 million units by the end of its lifespan. Now, for all intents and purposes, the 3DS actually had a great library throughout its life, but during its launch in particular, and I remember this myself very vividly, it was fairly sparse. There was definitely some quality games there, and of course, compared to the 2 games that the Nintendo 64 launched with, the Nintendo 3DS had much more than 2. That being said, 2 is still a magic number, at least in my case, because the only 2 launch games that I actually bought were Pilot Wings. Once again, we're going back to Pilot Wings Resort, and Steel Diver. So these are 2 of, probably in many people's opinions, the most prominent Nintendo first-party launch lineup titles for the Nintendo 3DS, and they were both fun, in my opinion. They were both enjoyable. I had nothing against these games. I particularly enjoyed Pilot Wings Resort. I thought it was a really, really fun game. And of course, the visuals look quite nice too. But it didn't have that big wow factor kind of game. The Nintendo 3DS launch lacked that one game that made you absolutely have to buy the system. Of course, the system had all these new features and gimmicks. We had 3D and everything, but what's the point of 3D if there were not many games to utilize them? Of course, we had some apps, of course, like Face Raiders and all these little apps that came included with the console, but they're not really full-fledged games, right? So while the launch lineup was better than the Nintendo 64's, it was still fairly weak, not having that big title to really sell it. So naturally, this actually did, in fact, affect the Nintendo 3DS's initial sales. Of course, the price didn't help either, but I do believe that the weak launch lineup actually also contributed to its weaker sales at the beginning of its life, until Nintendo decided to drop the price drastically, and around that similar time frame, Nintendo released one of the first big games for the 3DS, Super Mario 3D Land, and that's kind of where sales started to take off a little bit more. So now we bounce to the Switch. Let's talk about the Nintendo Switch. The Nintendo Switch, in my honest opinion, would have had a weak launch library if it were not for one particular game, and we all know what that game is. Zelda Breath of the Wild. When this game came out in 2017, it received basically critical acclaim. Everyone loved it, including myself. One of the most revolutionary open world games ever made. It was fantastic. And it was, of course, a fantastic time for Nintendo too, because it really sold the system. The Nintendo Switch basically flew off the shelves and started selling like crazy from the very beginning, really. It only increased exponentially from there. So the original Nintendo Switch is pretty much a success story in every front. Launched with an incredible killer app game and went on to sell over 130 million units. At this point, roughly 140 million units. So it is a wild success story. But now we come to the Switch 2. We've arrived at the Switch 2, and while it has yet to be announced, it is undeniably on its way. At one point, I would have believed it was coming out this year in 2024, but now it is likely to come out early next year, 2025. So with all that being said, will this follow the footsteps of the Switch? Will Nintendo have finally learned that, yes, launch lineups do matter and they help make a good first impression? And of course, the simple answer is yes, I do think Nintendo has learned their lessons. I do think ultimately the Switch 2 will have a good launch lineup. I think, if anything, it may be similar to the Switches, where we're going to have sort of a decent number of quality games, and there will be 1 or 2 big high-profile releases at launch, similar to the Switch. Of course, the big high-profile releases from Nintendo for the Switch were Zelda Breath of the Wild, obviously, and the lukewarm 1-2 Switch, which was a fun little demo, you could say, to showcase what the Switch could do and its features, but I wouldn't necessarily write home about it. I would prefer they return to something more Wii Sports-esque, where it's a little bit more chock full of content, a little bit more depth, if you will, so I'm kind of hoping they return back to that, or something like Nintendo Land would be pretty fun too, right? But nonetheless, I do expect Nintendo to have something big at launch, at least one big title that will really sell the system. And of course, I'm thinking that that title at this point will most likely be a brand new 3D Mario game. I think that that game is what Nintendo's planning to focus on and make as the main flagship title during the launch of the Switch 2. That will be the game that people will want to buy the console for, basically. At least to launch. Now, I also had theories that Metroid Prime 4 could potentially be a launch title as well, but at this point I'm thinking it'll probably be a launch window title, not necessarily releasing the same day as the system, but maybe a month or two after. That's what I'm thinking. So yes, I do think that the Nintendo Switch 2 will have a good launch lineup. I think Nintendo has learned from previous mistakes and has also learned from previous successes. Look at the Switch, and look at how successful that became after having a big killer app title. And sometimes it seems all it takes is one killer app title and a few other quality games outside of that. And that's basically what the Switch had. And when you look at the Wii launched with, of course, Zelda Twilight Princess, a big killer app title amongst a bunch of other quality games, but not necessarily anything that can overshadow Twilight Princess. But you had Twilight Princess and you had a handful of other quality games out, and that made for a good launch. And of course, look at the Wii. It sold over 100 million units worldwide. Again, the launch lineup isn't necessarily the reason why it sold 100 million units. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm just saying that it most likely had something, even a partial effect on the overall sales. Because of course, it is the system's first impression. People were flocking to play the system because of motion controls, of course, but once again, you can't do anything with those motion controls unless you had a good game to play, and of course, Twilight Princess and even Wii Sports had a lot to do with that. So anyways, guys, that is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good one. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.